Thus we can observe the distinctive parallel movement during the last 300 years, namely that on the one hand the laws of nature, the material order of things, the objective necessity of events emerge more clearly and distinctly, while on the other we see the emphasis upon the independent individuality, upon personal freedom, upon independence, Versigsein, in relation to all external and natural forces becoming more and more acute and increasingly stronger. Even the development of art in recent times exhibits the same dual character. The naturalism of Van Eyck and Quattrocento is, as it were, an elaboration of what is most individual in phenomena. The simultaneous appearance of satire, biography and drama in their first forms exhibit a naturalistic style that centers upon the individual as such. This occurred, by the way, at a time when the money economy began perceptibly to display its social implications. Even at the high point of Greek culture we find a quite objective view of the world that is close to the laws of nature as one side of their view of life, the other side of which embraced the complete inner freedom and self-directedness of the personality. To the extent that the Greeks lagged behind in the theoretical formulation of the concept of freedom and the self, a corresponding shortcoming prevailed in the rigorousness of their theories of nature. Whatever difficulties metaphysics may find in the relationship between the objective determination of things and the subjective freedom of the individual, as aspects of culture their development runs parallel and the accentuation of the one seems to require the accentuation of the other in order to preserve the equipoise of inner life. And here these general reflections touch upon the specific problems with which we are concerned. In the economy, too, the personal and objective sides of work are originally not yet separated. At first, the indifference slowly splits into opposites and the personal element increasingly recedes from production, product and exchange. This process, however, releases individual freedom. As we have just seen, individual freedom grows to the extent that nature becomes more objective and more real for us and displays the peculiarities of its own order so that this freedom increases with the objectivation and depersonalization of the economic universe. Just as the positive sense of individual independence is not awakened in the economic isolation of an unsocial existence, then neither is it awakened in a worldview which is as yet unfamiliar with the law-like regularity and strict objectivity of nature. The sense of a distinctive force and of a distinctive value of being independent is a concomitant of this opposition. Indeed, even with regard to our relationship to nature, it appears as if, in the isolation of a primitive economy, in other words, in the period of ignorance of the laws of nature in the modern sense, a much stronger bondage was reinforced by the superstitious interpretation of natural processes. Only through the growth of the economy to its full capacity, complexity and internal interaction does the mutual dependence of people emerge. The elimination of the personal element directs the individual towards his own resources and makes him more positively aware of his liberty than would be possible with the total lack of relationships. Money is the ideal representative of such a condition since it makes possible relationships between people but leaves them personally undisturbed. It is the exact measure of material achievements, but is very inadequate for the particular and the personal. To the discriminating consciousness, the restrictedness of objective dependencies that money provides is but the background that first throws the resulting differentiated personality and its freedom into full relief. 2. Possession as activity. One is accustomed to understanding the dynamics of life, especially where they relate to external objects, as either acquisition within which, in its broader sense, we also include labor or as the enjoyment of things. The possession of things, however, does not appear as movement but as a stationary and, as it were, substantial condition that relates to those other dynamics just as being relates to becoming. In contrast with such a notion, I believe that one must also characterize possession as an action if one wishes to grasp the whole depth and breadth of its meaning. The habit of considering possession as something passively accepted, as the unconditionally complying object which, to the extent that it is really possession, does not require any activity on our part, is false. This fact, misjudged in the realm of being, has taken refuge in the ethical realm, as is the case for instance of pious wishes, whenever we hear it as an exhortation that we should acquire what we want to own, that every possession entails at the same time an obligation, that one should make the most of one's opportunities, etc. At most, it will be conceded that one has to do something further with one's property. On its own, however, it is supposed to be something static, a terminal point, perhaps a point of departure for action but not action itself. If one looks more closely, this passive concept of property proves to be a fiction that is particularly well illustrated in certain primitive circumstances. In ancient northern Peru and ancient Mexico too, the tilling of the fields redistributed every year was a common task, but the yield was privately owned. Not only was no opportunities, etc. At most, it will be conceded that one has to do something further with one's property. On its own, however, it is supposed to be something static, a terminal point, perhaps a point of departure for action but not action itself. If one looks more closely, this passive concept of property proves to be a fiction that is particularly well illustrated in certain primitive circumstances. In ancient northern Peru and ancient Mexico too, the tilling of the fields redistributed every year was a common task, but the yield was privately owned. Not only was no one allowed to sell or give away his share, but he also completely lost his share if he voluntarily traveled to other parts and did not return in time for the cultivation of his tract of land. In the same way, the possession of a tract of land in the ancient German marches did not yet signify that one was a real member of the march. In order to be a full member, one also had to till the soil oneself and, as was stated in early judicial sentences, make use of water and grazing facilities and have one's own hearth. Ownership that is not to some extent activity is a mere abstraction. Ownership as the point of indifference between the movement that leads towards it and the movement that leads beyond it shrinks to zero. The static concept of property is nothing but the active enjoyment or treatment of the object, transposed into a latent condition, and the guarantee for the fact that one can at any time enjoy it or act upon it. The child wants to have every object that interests him, one should give it to him. This only means that the child wants to do something with the object, frequently only to look at it and touch it. The concept of property among primitive peoples is not at all characterized by the permanence or the fundamental timelessness of our concept of it. Rather, it encompasses only a momentary relationship of enjoyment and action with the object which is often, in the next instant, given away or lost with complete indifference. Thus, ownership in its original form is much more unstable than stable. Every higher form of ownership develops as a gradual increase in durability, security and permanency of the relation to the object. Mere momentariness of the object transforms itself into a permanent possibility of falling back upon it without the content or the realization of the object meaning anything other or more than a series of individual undertakings or fructifications. The notion that ownership means something qualitatively new and substantial, in contrast to individual acts of disposing with things, belongs to the class of typical errors which, for instance, has become so important in the history of the concept of causality. After Hume had called attention to the fact that any factually necessary connection that we term cause and effect could never be established, that the empirically real is only the temporal succession of two events, Kant seems to preserve the security of our image of the world by the proof that the mere sense perception of a temporal sequence is not yet experience as such. Rather, this experience, even in the empiricist's sense, presupposes a real objectivity and necessity of causal sequences. In other words, whereas in the first case perception was to be confined merely to subjective and individual impressions, Kant pointed to the objective validity of our knowledge independent of the individual case and the individual perceiving subject, just as property exists over and above its individual usage. What is at issue here is an application of the very same category by which we sought to establish the essence of objective value in the first chapter. Beyond the specific contents of our consciousness, perceptions, impulses and emotions lies a realm of objects, in the awareness of which there hovers the thought that they have a lasting objective validity, independent of their singularity and chance of being perceived. The enduring substance of things, the regular order of their fate, the steadfast character of men and the norms of morality, the demands of the law and the religious meaning of the whole universe, all this has, as it were, an ideal existence and validity which can only be expressed in terms of the independence of the individual facts in which that substance and lawfulness presents itself or in which those demands,